This is Make It Then Tell Everybody. I'm Dan Berry, and I'm going to explain to you all about making a typeface from your own lettering. It's only going to be a quick video because if I go into a lot of detail, it's going to be incredibly long. I'm working on a course at the moment on how to make a typeface, so hopefully that's something you can look at fairly soon, but it's a lot of work. There's a lot of detail that goes into making a font. So one of the reasons you would make a font is it saves you time. You can type things out rather than tediously lettering things. You can be far more flexible with the edits, so if you've made a spelling mistake, it's a case of just typing it rather than having to go into Photoshop and deleting things. It can really complement your style if you do it properly. Things like translations, that could be made much simpler as well by having a typeface. So that's a lot of the good reasons. There's also like a downside to all of this. The downside for me is that it's really tedious to make. Typefaces are tedious. I'm going to say this a lot. They're tedious to make. You've got to have quite a good attention span to be able to focus on doing a typeface because it's tedious. Did I say it's tedious? It can look a bit mechanical. I'll give you an example of that in a minute. It can feel not quite as expressive. You know, when you're lettering, you can go, yeah, and really make emphasis on particular letters. It's harder to do that, I think, with a typeface. It's tedious. I don't know if I mentioned that. Also, the software can be expensive. I use Illustrator, and I use a program called Glyphs on the Mac. So on Illustrator, you can make the shape of the letters, and then Glyphs will turn it into the typeface. There are alternatives. There's FontLab. There's a few other sort of affordable ones. Glyphs does a mini version, which is, I think, like €40, or a full version, which is like €160. I really like it. I like Glyphs a lot. I have the full version, and I find it intuitive and pleasant to use. You can use these online font generators where they'll ask you to fill out a grid with your letters, and I found them to be a little bit clunky, and you end up with mechanical looking typefaces. Let me explain. The thing about hand lettering things is you can make it look really cool. This is one of my lettering. I quite like it. I think it looks cool. Then as soon as you see that thing repeated over and over again, you start to notice these repeating patterns. And once you've noticed it, you can't really unnotice it. It sort of reveals itself as mechanical in these repeats. So something that starts out looking fairly organic and natural can end up looking mechanical and repetitive. And I think that when we recognize these patterns in lettering, the lettering somehow loses a tiny bit of credibility. It does to me anyway, but I'm one of these typography nerds who notices things like that. But like I said, once you've noticed it, you can't unnotice it. So, like I said, I'm building a course at the moment on font design, and I'm using Lizz Lunney's lettering as an example. If you don't know Lizz's comics, you're in for a treat. They're brill. So her lettering has as much character as the characters do. They're brilliant. I really like them. So the challenge for me here is to create something that imitates Lizz's style. It's called Disneyland, which is wonderful. I made Liz a typeface. So this is what it looks like. This is the view from the other side after it's been finished. So as you can see, the word banana, 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 it looks different each time it's typed. So I'm going to show you first how it works, what it can do, what you can do with it, and then I'll show you how I got it to do that. Okay, so here is Disneyland in action. What I'm doing here is showing you how this thing's actually going to work. So we can see if we look at repeating letter forms like the L's in called or different, the F's there, or the P's in appears, you'll see that they're different each time. This is because we're using an OpenType feature called contextual alternates. What this means is that there's basically 6 different versions of the alphabet that it'll cycle through, but there's 6 different versions in the uppercase and the lowercase, plus the default ones. So there's actually 14 alphabets that we can access here. If I turn off the contextual alternates, there we go. It's just showing you if you look at the Z's in Disneyland, you can see the Z's are the same, the P's are the same, the F's are the same. It looks okay, but it doesn't look hand-lettered. Now this looks kind of hand-lettered. One of the cool things about OpenType is that if I hover over any of them, I can then choose a different letter from any one of these different alternates there. You can also see which set we're on there through the open type feature there, which is pretty cool. So if we have a big block of text like this, it's going to cycle us through all these different versions of the alphabet. If we're going to do something slightly more difficult, I think, let's just hello you. Let's do that. Now imagine we've got a comic where all of the characters arrive in a room and they all say hello you at the same time. Now if you're going to type this out 3 different ways, they're going to end up being the same each time. So if I turn off the contextual alternates, that doesn't kind of work, because then you got that mechanical look to it. So what I can do is ask it to call things from different sets of the alphabet. So we can have these similar things, the same text, but done in different ways, and we can keep doing this. We can do this up to 14 times, because we've got this the default set, and then we've got these 6 sets. We've also got the uppercase and the lowercase, so we should squinting be able to have 14 people burst into this room and all of them speak with a slightly different voice. That's the idea, which I think is pretty cool. OpenType has the option for doing 20 alternates, so that would be 42 altogether options. That's a heck of a lot of work, though. That's 42 versions of each letter, which is a bit much, probably. It's entirely possible, but also a bit mad. The other cool thing I like working on in Illustrator is that you can use the text touch type tool, this one here, which means that you can select by letter each one, and you can give slight rotations and move it around. Let's see, we can budge that one in there. Should we zoom in a touch? So this one, we can shift that around, we can move that back there, we can move that back there. So if you did want to do something a little crazier with it, yeah, you can do that as well. That's cool. That's pretty neat, hey? So that's basically how it works. Now you'll notice that there's no bold. This is just a single weight font. If we were going to do a bold as well, we'd have to recreate all of those letters with a bold thing. So each new sort of variation, the bold, the italic, it's not a thing that Illustrator does or Photoshop does. That's a thing that's got to be designed in by the designer, which is, did I mention it's tedious? It's pretty tedious, but that's basically what we can do with this. And then I'm just going to swap programs and I'll talk about how we did that briefly. So that's what it does. And here's the process of how I actually made the typeface. First of all, I made Liz letter out a bunch of nonsense. I asked her to use the tools that she'd normally use for lettering, the size she'd normally use for lettering, the paper that you'd normally use for lettering, and here is a bunch of nonsense. Now, when you use these online font generators, generally asks you to type out the alphabet. So you do. But the problem with that, in my opinion, is you don't get a natural sample of the lettering. You end up with these letter forms that appear in isolation from a word. And my experience is that people will create the shape of the letter slightly differently when they're in isolation rather than when they're in the middle of a word. So this nonsense that I've asked Liz to type out here is designed to give me lots of repeating letter combinations, as well as the most frequently used trigraphs and digraphs. That's like 3-letter, 2-letter combinations in the English language. Plus it's got all of the numbers and punctuation and stuff in there. So that gets lettered out and sent to me. Then I will get that into Illustrator and I'll make an art brush that imitates Liz's line, and I'll go over and I'll trace each letter form. The thing I like about Illustrator, is that it has actions. So instead of having to do the same repetitive thing over and over again, I can set it to a function key and hit F1 and it does that. So it sets up, expanding the appearance and simplifying it, doing the pathfinder, scaling it because typefaces are measured in a magical made-up measurement system, and everything else uses inches, millimeters, pixels. So never can be easy. So when it goes into glyphs, I'll make sure that everything's in the right place. Did I mention that it's really tedious? It's really tedious. So I did this over and over and over again. And I mentioned earlier that sort of repeating alphabet that it'll cycle through. So I have these 6 or 7 different versions of the upper and lowercase for each letter that will get cycled through it. Then we do kerning. Kerning is the process of setting individually all of the measurements between each combination of letters, punctuation, and numbers. So where you have diagonals like in an AV or an overhang with like a TO or TIT, A, anything with diagonals or an overhang ends up having a weird looking space to it. And if you're not careful, it just looks terrible, absolutely dreadful. That's kind of the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is it actually reads as two separate words, which might not be a great look. It's a really, really tedious process. It takes hours and hours and hours and hours to get all of that combination, all of that kerning sorted, and you lie down on the floor and pray for death, basically. That's all you want at the end of the day. Once that's done, I'm inputting some code here. I'm using OpenType features. I'm using contextual alternates. So every time I type, it then shifts to the next alphabet, and then to the next alphabet, and then to the next alphabet. And there's a little bit of code in there as well to mix it up. So every time you hit a vowel, it changes the alphabet. Every time you hit a consonant, it changes the alphabet as well, just to mix it up and make it a little more random, I guess. So then we move on to testing, lots and lots of testing and fixing and testing. On the left here, we've got the typeface in action, and on the right, we've got Lizz's original comic there. So it's equivalent. I think it kind of looks about right. I was really happy with the way that this typeface came out. Really happy. It was a hard job, and it was hard to get everything to sort of line up and look consistently inconsistent enough that it looked like Lizz's lettering, but it was still neat and tidy and usable and legible. So that is the really, really short version of the full process. The big, long process, I think, is hours and hours of lots of minute detail in the way that Illustrator works, or the way that glyphs work, or the way that typefaces work, or the way that people read. It's all really fascinating, and I love this stuff, and I think you kind of have to love typography to make a font. But there we go. That is, in a nutshell, the most condensed version of how to make a typeface I can possibly do. I hope you've enjoyed it. If this is something you're interested in, keep an eye out for that course that I'm making. My name's Dan Berry. I run a podcast called Make It Then Tell Everybody. Thanks very much.